Hello, guys. Tonight we slip into the moonlit vales of ancient Greece, where the goddess of the wild hunt doesn't storm the scene with thunderbolts or heroic fanfare, but arrives on a whisper of waves and shadowed hills, her first cry echoing like a wolf's distant call under a silver sky. Feel the cool Aegean spray misting your face as dawn's hesitant glow creeps over jagged cliffs, the air thick with salt and the faint, primal stir of untamed earth awakening, olive branches trembling, distant howls threading the mist, pulling you into a world where gods brush against mortal grit in the quietest, most forgotten corners. But here's a cheeky nudge. You probably won't survive this tale unscathed, because once Artemis's wild gaze hooks you, those everyday routines of yours might start feeling a little too tame, urging you toward moonlit trails you never knew you craved. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see where in the world you're drifting off with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, if you will, the quiet ripple of waves against the rocky shores of a small, unremarkable island in the heart of the Aegean Sea. It is Delos, a place that in the grand sweep of history often fades into the background, overshadowed by the towering acropolises of Athens or the sun-baked temples of Delphi. But here, in this forgotten speck of land, something stirs, not with the clash of bronze spears or the thunder of divine wrath, but with the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of a world tilting toward the wild. You are there now, standing on the pebbled beach as the first light of dawn creeps over the horizon, casting long shadows from the low hills that rise like the humped backs of sleeping beasts. The air carries the faint salt tang of the sea, mingled with the earthy scent of olive groves just beginning to stir from winter's grip. This is the world into which Artemis would enter, not as a blaze of glory, but as a whisper carried on the wind. Delos in those ancient days, let's say around the time when the Mycenaean kings still held sway over the mainland, though the myths themselves blur the edges of chronology, was no paradise of myth. It was a practical place, a trading post where fishermen mended their nets under the relentless sun, and merchants bartered amphorae of wine and oil for the rough wool of island sheep. The island's soil was thin, its water scarce, drawn from cisterns fed by seasonal rains that often failed. Life here demanded resilience, the kind forged in the quiet routines of survival, rising before the cocks crow to check the olive presses, or scanning the horizon for the sails of Cretan traders who might bring news from afar, or disease if the winds turned foul. The inhabitants, a mix of Ionians and Carians with skin bronzed by labor, lived in clustered huts of mud brick and thatch, their days punctuated by the creak of looms and the low murmur of prayers to forgotten sea gods. Yet beneath this ordinariness lay a deeper rhythm, one tied to the cycles of moon and tide, where women gathered in the evenings to share stories of births and losses, their voices soft against the crash of waves. It is into this world that Leto, a titaness of gentle demeanor and unyielding determination, arrives, heavy with child. You can picture her, perhaps, making her way across the strait from the mainland, her steps measured and weary, guided by the faint pull of destiny that the poets would later call the will of Hera. Leto was no warrior queen. She was a figure of quiet endurance, her beauty said to rival the dawn, but her life marked by the bitterness of divine jealousy. Hera, ever vigilant, had decreed that no solid land would harbor Leto's twins, scattering her from sanctuary to sanctuary, like chaff on the wind. Delos, then a mere floating rock adrift in the sea, or so the old tales insist, though geologists today might chuckle at the notion, was her last hope. Asteria, Leto's sister, had once transformed into the island itself to escape Zeus's advances, and now it bobbed uncertainly, its jagged shores a testament to reluctant stability. When Leto's foot touched its soil, the earth trembled slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of what was to come. The island's few dwellers, roused from their slumbers, watched from afar, their faces etched with the wariness of those who know the gods too well. The birth itself unfolds, not in a burst of celestial light, but in the mundane grit of human frailty. You are in the dim interior of a simple shelter, perhaps a cave hollowed from the island's limestone cliffs, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp stone and smoldering herbs. Midwives, local women with calloused hands from years of weaving and winnowing, cluster around Leto, their whispers a steady undercurrent to her labored breaths. They burn bay leaves for Apollo, the unborn brother, and murmur invocations to Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, whose aid Hera has cunningly withheld. The process stretches through the night, marked by the drip of water from the cave ceiling and the distant cry of a shearwater wheeling overhead. Leto's pains come in waves, each contraction a reminder of the god's capriciousness. She grips a smoothed olive branch, its bark rough under her palms, grounding herself in the island's sparse flora. The midwives apply compresses of soaked wool, cooled in the cistern's precious water, and chant rhythmic phrases in the old Dorian tongue. Phrases about the moon's pull on the tides, about the wild herbs that ease the body's betrayal. As the hours wear on, the first hints of dawn filter through the cave's mouth, painting the walls in hues of rose and gold. It is then, in that liminal space between night and day, that Artemis emerges. The texts, Hesiod's Theogony, later echoed in the Homeric hymns, describe her as arriving fully formed, her eyes already sharp with the gaze of the huntress. But let us linger on the human scale, the details that the epics gloss over. She is small, her skin slick and flushed, crying not with the wail of vulnerability, but a keen, alert sound that startles the shearwaters into flight. The midwives wrap her in a swaddling of soft lamb's wool, dyed with madder root for a faint red hue, symbolizing the earth's blood. Leto, exhausted but resolute, cradles her daughter, tracing the delicate curve of an ear that seems attuned already to the rustle of leaves in the wind. Artemis's name, they say, derives from Artemos, the unscattered or the safe, a nod to the wholeness she brings to this fractured moment. Yet even in this triumph, there is the shadow of her brother Apollo, still unborn, his arrival delayed by the child's own precocity. Word spreads slowly across Delos, as news does in such isolated places. The fishermen, hauling their boats onto the shingle beach, pause to offer libations of unmixed wine poured into the sand, their gestures practical rather than fervent. "A goddess among us," one mutters, wiping salt-crusted hands on his chiton, while another nods, remembering tales of Zeus's wandering eye. The islanders' lives, so bound to the sea's rhythms, begin to shift imperceptibly. Women in the weaving sheds incorporate new patterns into their cloths, subtle crescent motifs, evoking the moon's sickle phase, while men carve small effigies from driftwood, wolves with eyes of polished shell, to place at the hearth. These are not grand rituals. They are the quiet adaptations of a people who understand that divinity touches the everyday, like dew on a nettle leaf. Artemis, from her earliest breaths, embodies this. Not the thunderous Olympian, but the guardian of margins, the wild places where cultivated fields give way to untamed scrub. As days turn to weeks, Leto recovers in the cave's shelter, nursing her daughter amid the island's sparse provisions. The midwives teach her the local ways, how to forage for wild thyme and oregano on the hillsides, their leaves crushed to flavor the thin barley porridge that sustains them. Artemis, alert even in infancy, fixes her gaze on the flickering shadows cast by olive branches against the wall, as if memorizing the dance of light and dark. The islanders bring small gifts, a basket of figs, still warm from the sun, a flask of goat's milk curdled just so. In return, Leto shares fragments of her story, the flight from Hera's wrath, the cold nights on barren shores, binding the community in a web of shared secrecy. Delos, once adrift, now feels anchored, its people sensing that this birth has woven their fates into the larger tapestry of the gods. But as the moon waxes toward fullness, casting its silver pallor over the waves, a restlessness stirs. Apollo's birth looms, his cries destined to echo farther than any mortal's. The midwives whisper of omens, a wolf sighted on the eastern ridge, its howl carrying farther than usual, and a sudden bloom of asphodel along the path to the cistern. Artemis, swaddled against her mother's chest, seems to listen, her tiny fists clenching as if grasping for a bow yet unfletched. The island holds its breath, the routines of daily life, mending nets, grinding grain, now laced with anticipation. What role will this child play in the unfolding drama? Will her wild essence temper the sun god's fire, or ignite conflicts yet unforeseen? And so, as you sit by the cave's mouth, the sea lapping at your feet, you wonder, in the quiet cradle of Delos, what unseen threads does Artemis begin to pull, drawing the wild into the heart of the divine order? You linger still on that pebbled shore of Delos, the sea's murmur a constant companion as the days stretch into a tentative spring. The olive trees, their branches gnarled like the hands of old fishermen, begin to haze with new growth, and the air thickens with the hum of bees foraging among the wild thyme. Artemis, now a few weeks into her young life, rests in Leto's arms as they venture from the cave's dim confines into the island's sparse light. The Titaness moves with the careful gait of one still mending, her tunic stained faintly with the milk that seeps through the woolen wrappings. Around you, the islanders resume their rhythms, women bent over stone querns, grinding barley into coarse meal that dusts their skirts like fine sand. Men repairing the low walls of dry stone pens where goats bleat against the fence. These are the threads of existence that bind Delos, unyielding and uncelebrated. Yet it is within them that the divine takes tentative root, like a sapling pushing through cracked earth. Leto's recovery unfolds in the quiet cadence of necessity. The midwives, those steadfast women whose names, Irene perhaps or Thalea, echo only in the oral annals of local lore, return daily with poultices of fig leaves and honey, applied to soothe the lingering aches of labor. They teach Leto the island's secrets for sustenance, how to identify the tender shoots of mallow along the coastal paths, their leaves boiled into a mucilaginous tea that eases the body's weariness, or the way to leach the bitterness from acorn meal gathered from the scattered oaks, grinding it anew each dawn to stretch the meager stores. You watch as Leto learns these arts. Her fingers, once accustomed to the ethereal halls of Titan realms, now stained with the green sap of herbs. Artemis, cradled close, stirs at the scents, her small nose wrinkling in what might be the first flicker of curiosity for the wild's bouquet. The child nurses greedily, her suckling a rhythmic pull that mirrors the tide's ebb, and in those moments, Leto whispers fragments of prophecy, tales of a daughter who will roam the untamed fringes, her feet light on dew-kissed grass. The community of Delos, small as it is, perhaps no more than 100 souls scattered across the island's 5 square miles, circles this new center without fanfare. The headman, a weathered figure named Krios with a limp from a long-ago fall among the rocks, organizes the sharing of provisions. Goat's milk, warm and frothy from the morning milking, is portioned into clay jars sealed with beeswax, delivered to the cave with the practicality of those who know famine's shadow. In exchange, Leto offers counsel drawn from her divine lineage, advice on routing aqueducts from the higher springs to better feed the cisterns, or the timing of seed sowing aligned with the Pleiades rising. Details mundane yet vital, for Delos's thin soil yields grudgingly, its harvests often halved by drought or the gnawing teeth of island voles. The women form a loose circle in the evenings, seated on rush mats outside the weaving sheds, their needles flashing in the fading light as they mend tunics or plait baskets from oleander twigs. Here, stories flow like the thin rivulets from the cliffs. One recounts a season when the winds carried locusts from the east, stripping the barley fields bare, and how the survivors turned to fishing with bone hooks carved from sheep femurs, their lines weighted with smoothed pebbles. Leto listens, her presence a quiet elevation of these tales, infusing them with the gravity of cosmic cycles, the moon's phases that govern not just tides, but the swell of wombs and the ripening of grain. Artemis, even in her infancy, begins to reveal the contours of her nature, subtle as the first cracks in parched soil. You might imagine holding her, the weight slight and warm against your chest, as her eyes, gray as storm clouds over the strait, fix on the horizon where sea meets sky. During a midday lull, when the sun beats down and the islanders seek shade beneath woven reed awnings, Leto carries her to the low hill overlooking the sacred lake. Its waters stagnant and fringed with reeds that whisper in the breeze. There, amid the calls of herons stabbing at minnows, Artemis quiets, her breaths sinking with the wind's sigh through the scrub. The islanders note it. A ewe from the flock wanders too near a thicket of brambles, its wool catching, and though no one approaches, the creature extricates itself unharmed, as if guided by an unseen hand. Or the way wild dogs, lean shadows descended from some long-forgotten sailor's hound, circle the cave at dusk but never enter, their yellow eyes reflecting the hearth's glow with a wary respect. These are not miracles proclaimed in verse, but the incremental shifts that mark a presence. The sudden abundance of hares in the rocky gullies, their forms darting like silver arrows under the moon, or the bloom of silverweed along the paths, its leaves a balm for weary feet. As the weeks deepen into the equinox's approach, the shadow of Apollo lengthens. Leto's belly swells anew, the second child pressing with an urgency that disrupts her sleep, sending her pacing the cave's floor in the small hours. The midwives prepare, gathering birthing stools of olive wood smoothed by generations, padded with layers of dried asphodel to cradle the body. They discuss Eileithia's reluctant aid, Hera's curse manifesting in prolonged labors across the lands, and brew infusions of silphium, that rare herb traded from distant Cyrene, its resin a guarded remedy for easing divine obstructions. The air in the cave grows thick with anticipation, the smoke from the hearth curling like question marks toward the ceiling. Leto, drawing on her Titan resilience, shares meals with the islanders, a simple stew of lentils simmered with wild garlic, eaten from shared bowls that pass hand to hand, fostering bonds forged in scarcity. In these gatherings, the talk turns to the twins' fates. Apollo, destined for the lyre's strings and oracular flames, a counterpoint to his sister's silent arrows. The fishermen, their hands scarred from hauling lines, muse on how the gods' offspring might bless the seas, steadying the winds that scatter their catches, or filling the nets with mullet fat as a full moon. Yet beneath this communal weave, tensions simmer like the slow boil of a cauldron. Hera's spies, perhaps the ever-watchful Iris, or subtler agents in the form of sudden storms that lash the strait, cast a pall. One night, as thunder rumbles distant over the Peloponnese, a squall upends a trading skiff off the western point, its cargo of Cypriot copper ingots lost to the depths. The islanders salvage what they can, splintered timbers lashed into temporary repairs for their own boats, and in the retelling, fingers point skyward, invoking the Queen of Heaven's grudge. Leto, undeterred, teaches Artemis a lullaby in the old Titan tongue, its syllables rolling like pebbles in a stream. Verses about the moon's quiet sovereignty, her light piercing the darkest thickets. The child responds, her gurgles harmonizing in a way that stills the midwives' fears, if only for a breath. Delos itself seems to brace, its floating myth stabilizing as roots delve deeper into the seabed. Or so the geomyths suggest. The island's gradual settling a metaphor for the twins anchoring in the mortal realm. Through it all, the daily grind persists, a testament to human tenacity. You join the women at the loom, your fingers learning the shuttle's path as they weave linen fine enough for Leto's veils, threads dyed with the island's lichens in shades of muted earth. The men demonstrate knot tying for nets, loops that hold fast against the pull of tuna schools migrating north. These skills, passed from parent to child like heirlooms of bone and fiber, underscore the resilience that mirrors Artemis's emerging essence, not conquest, but harmony with the untamed, the survival etched in every careful step. As the moon swells to fullness once more, its light bathing the cave in argent clarity, Leto's pains begin anew, sharper this time, heralding Apollo's arrival. The midwives light lamps of olive oil, their flames steady against the wind seeping through the entrance, and the island falls into a hushed vigil. But as the first contractions grip, a question lingers in the salt-laden air. Will Artemis, this child of margins and moonlight, stand as midwife to her brother's birth, weaving her wild guardianship into the very fabric of his solar ascent? Or will the shadows of Hera's envy pull them asunder before the dawn? The moon hangs at its zenith now, a luminous disk unmarred by cloud, its light spilling across the cave's threshold like spilled milk from an overturned amphora. You stand just outside, the night's chill seeping through the thin weave of your chiton, as the sounds from within carry on the still air. Leto's measured breaths, ragged at the edges, the midwife's low chants, threading through the pauses like the warp in a half-woven cloth. Delos sleeps uneasily around you, the island's contours softened in silver, its olive groves mere silhouettes against the sea's dark expanse. The goats in their pens shift restlessly, their bells tinkling faintly, as if attuned to the labor's pulse. This is the culmination. The moment when the divine intersects the mortal not with fanfare, but with the raw persistence of flesh and bone, the quiet insistence that even gods must navigate the straits of birth. Inside the cave, the scene unfolds with the deliberate pace of a ritual honed by necessity. The birthing stool, its legs carved from the island's resilient lentisk wood, supports Leto as she bears down, her face sheened with sweat that gleams like dew on asphodel. The midwives, sleeves rolled to their elbows and hands steady from years of similar vigils, apply cool cloths wrung from the cistern's hoard. Water precious as nectar in this arid place, now sanctified by use. One, the elder with silver threads in her braid, murmurs encouragements drawn from the old women's lore. Breathe with the wave as the sea claims the shore, her voice a anchor amid the contraction's surge. They have prepared as best they can against Hera's meddling, offerings of barley cakes baked in the hearth's embers, scattered at the cave mouth to appease the unseen forces, and a libation of time-infused water poured into a shallow basin, its ripples catching the lamplight like fleeting stars. Artemis, now several weeks old and swaddled in a cradle of woven reeds nearby, stirs fitfully, her eyes half open in the dimness, as if sensing the echo of her own arrival. The labor stretches through the night, each phase marked by the incremental details that define endurance. Leto's pains peak and ebb, her body a vessel strained by divine decree. Yet her resolve, forged in the Titan's ancient fires, holds firm. The midwives rotate shifts, one stepping out to the fire pit to reheat the herbal compresses, their steam carrying the sharp tang of sage gathered from the cliff's crevices. You might assist, passing a bowl of diluted vinegar to cleanse the hands, its acrid bite a reminder of the earth's unyielding chemistry. Stories circulate in hushed tones to distract from the toil. The elder midwife recounts a birth from her youth, when a storm had flooded the cisterns, forcing them to boil seawater over driftwood fires, the salt crystals forming like tears on the babe's skin. These anecdotes, banal in their intimacy, underscore the universality of survival, the way Delos's women, like their foremothers across the archipelago, turn scarcity into strategy, weaving resilience from the frayed edges of circumstance. As the eastern sky pales to the color of diluted wine, Apollo makes his entrance. The Homeric hymn speaks of his cry shaking the earth, but here, in the cave's confines. It is a robust wail that startles the doves roosting in the entrance, their wings fluttering like parchment pages. He emerges vigorous, his skin ruddy as the dawn, limbs kicking with an energy that belies the ordeal. The midwives work swiftly, severing the cord with a flint blade flaked fresh from the island's outcrops, then swaddling him in linen softened by repeated washings in the lye of wood ash. Leto, spent but luminous, gathers both children to her chest, Apollo's warmth mingling with Artemis's cooler presence, their breaths sinking in a fragile triad. The cave fills with a profound quiet, broken only by the drip of condensation from the ceiling and the distant lap of waves. Artemis, alert as ever, extends a tiny hand toward her brother, her fingers brushing his cheek in what the midwives later deem a blessing, an act of midwifery beyond her years, easing the final pangs as if invoking the moon's soothing pull. Dawn breaks fully now, painting the cave walls in strokes of amber and rose, as word ripples through Delos like a stone skipped across the lagoon. The fishermen, already astir with their lines coiled and hooks baited with octopus scraps, pause on the beach to pour offerings into the shallows, handfuls of salt mixed with crushed shells, symbolic of the twins' dual natures, land and sea, wild and light. Krios, the headman, summons the community to the central hearth, a ring of stones blackened by uncounted fires, where they share a communal meal of flatbreads baked on hot pebbles, topped with the first shoots of fennel from the hills. Leto emerges into the light, children in arms, her steps tentative but unbowed, and the islanders form a loose circle, their faces weathered by wind and want, offering nods more than bows. Gifts accumulate modestly, a necklace of cowrie shells for Artemis, threaded on sinew from a sacrificed kid, a tiny rattle for Apollo, fashioned from dried gourd seeds encased in olive wood. These tokens, crafted from the island's leavings, carry the weight of practicality, items that might soothe a fretful night or ward off the island's chill winds. In the days that follow, the twins' presence infuses Delos with a subtle transformation, one woven into the fabric of daily toil rather than etched in marble. The women incorporate the children's cries into their weaving rhythms, the shuttles click-click harmonizing with gurgles that seem to predict the wind's shifts, fair breezes for fuller nets, or gales that demand the boats be dragged high above the tide line. Leto, drawing on her recovered strength, aids in the spring planting, her hands guiding the dibble into the thin soil as they sow emmer wheat in furrows aligned with the solstice's arc. She teaches the islanders to observe the moon's phases more keenly, marking Artemis's namesake in their calendars scratched on beeswax tablets. The crescent for sowing wild herbs, the full for harvesting the sea's bounty. Apollo's influence manifests in the sudden clarity of the air, ailments of the chest easing among the elders, treated with infusions of island hyssop that now seem more potent, as if touched by solar vigor. Yet this idyll is tempered by the gods' broader currents. Messengers, swift-footed runners from the mainland, their calves scarred from rocky paths, arrive bearing tidings of Hera's court, where whispers of the twins' birth stir unrest among the Olympians. Delos, sensing its role as cradle, fortifies its edges, low walls topped with thorns, watchfires lit on the promontories to signal approaching sails. The islanders adapt, their lives a mosaic of caution and continuity. mending roofs with fresh thatch before the summer heats, or curing fish in salt pans that evaporate under the relentless sun. Artemis and Apollo, tended in the cave's expanded shelter, grow in tandem. She, reaching for the shadows at the room's edges, her coos mimicking the hoot of a nightjar. He, turning toward the light, his laughs bright as the lyre's first pluck. Leto watches them, her stories now encompassing the pair's intertwined fates, the huntress who clears the paths for the prophet's visions, the balance of wild and word that would echo through the ages. As the season turns toward summer, with the cicadas' drone filling the air like a persistent hymn, Delos fades into the background of myth, its people dispersing to the mainland's call or the pull of trade winds. The cave becomes a shrine in memory, its walls etched with simple spirals evoking the twins' arrival. You walk the paths one last time, the ground firm beneath your feet, the sea's horizon unbroken. In this quiet genesis, Artemis emerges not as a distant deity, but as the embodiment of those margins where survival meets the sacred. The wolf's shadow in the olive grove, the moon's light on a fisherman's net. Her birth, entwined with Apollo's, reshapes the divine order, infusing it with the resilience of ordinary lives. The midwife's steady hand, the shared bowl of porridge, the unspoken pacts against envy. Reflect then as the sun climbs higher. In our own fractured times, does Artemis's legacy remind us that true guardianship lies not in thunderous decrees, but in the patient tending of wild edges, the places where human tenacity defies the gods' caprice, weaving endurance into the very stars. Picture yourself descending into the folded valleys of Arcadia, where the Peloponnese's spine rises in rugged folds of limestone and schist, etched by millennia of rain and frost into a landscape that seems to breathe with the earth's own quiet pulse. It is late summer, the air heavy with the resinous scent of pine and the faint, acrid tang of sun-baked thyme crushed underfoot. Arcadia, in the shadow of the Mycenaean collapse, say around the time when linear B-tablets still whispered of palace economies crumbling into pastoral obscurity, was no idyllic pasture of Pan's pipes and nymphs' dances, though the later poets would romanticize it so. Instead, it was a place of stark pragmatism, where shepherds in woolen cloaks, patched with leather, navigated goat trails steep as ladders. Their crooks fashioned from hazel branches coppiced yearly to ensure straightness. The soil here, thin and pebbled like the bed of a mountain stream, yielded barley and lentils only after laborious terracing, walls of dry-laid stone that snaked the hillsides, built by hands calloused from generations of the same unyielding toil. You tread these paths now, your sandals grinding against the grit as the sun dips toward the Tagetus range, casting long shadows that pool in the hollows like ink spilled from a scribe's reed. The heart of this story beats in the village of Chaeronea, a cluster of perhaps 50 households huddled against the northern slopes, where the Leiden River's tributaries carve silver threads through the oak woods. Life in Chaeronea revolved around the loom and the herd, twin pillars of survival in a land where winters could bury a man in snowdrifts deeper than his height, and summers parch the streams to trickles. Women rose with the false dawn, kindling hearths with flint-struck sparks on tinder of dried fungi. to bake flatbreads of emmer flour mixed with ground acorns leached overnight in running water. A process that demanded vigilance, lest the tannins turn the dough bitter as bile. The men, meanwhile, drove flocks to the higher pastures, their paths marked by cairns of flat stones, each pile a silent testament to wanderers who had paused to add their pebble, invoking safe passage from the unseen watchers of the wild. These were Arcadians, descendants of those who had clung to the old ways when the sea peoples ravaged the coasts, their dialects thick with Doric inflections. Their gods invoked not in marble halls, but in the forked boughs of wild olive trees, where libations of goat's blood soaked the roots. Into this weave of routine steps Artemis, now a maiden on the cusp of her divine adolescence. The myths place her ageless, but let us imagine her in the bloom of what mortals call 14 summers. Her form lithe as a fawn's, eyes keen as flint flakes. She arrives not on a chariot of foam-flecked stags, but as a shadow slipping through the tree line, drawn by the land's untamed pulse that resonates with her own. The Homeric hymns hint at her wanderings, her choice of companions from the nymphs of river and ridge, but the true texture lies in the ordinary. The way she pauses at a spring to cup water in her palms, its chill shocking against skin warmed by the hike. Or how she notes the spiral of a snail's shell embedded in the path's mud, a pattern that speaks of the world's coiled secrets. Arcadia calls to her because it is the last bastion of the feral in a Greece tilting toward the plow and the polis. The place where fields fray into maquis scrub, alive with the scuffle of porcupines and the screech of eagle owls at dusk. The village women first encounter her at the communal spring, a basin hewn from bedrock and fed by an underground vein that never quite runs dry, even in the driest July. You are among them, skirt hiked to your knees as you rinse spindle whorls in the flow, the clay cool and slick under your fingers. They are a hardy lot. Phoebe, broad-shouldered from years of scything wild grasses for thatch. Lycia, her fingers nimble from twisting wool into yarn on a drop spindle that whirs like a trapped bee, and others whose names blend into the chorus of their chatter. Complaints about a ew's stubborn lameness, or the proper ratio of lye to fat for rendering tallow soap from the autumn cull. Artemis approaches barefoot, her tunic of fawn hide unadorned save for a belt of braided rushes, her hair unbound and tangled with burrs from the undergrowth. She kneels without ceremony, dipping her face to drink, and when she rises, water droplets trace paths down her neck like tears on a statue's cheek. The women fall silent, not in awe, but in the wary assessment of strangers in tight-knit places. Is she a trader's daughter from Tegea, or one escaped from a mainland household, fleeing the yoke of marriage? What unfolds is no divine epiphany, but a gradual threading of her presence into their days, much like the warp stretched taut on a loom before the weft begins its dance. Artemis lingers, drawn by the women's craft, for in Arcadia, weaving was more than labor. It was a map of the seasons, threads dyed with madder from the riverbanks for blood-red sunsets, or wove from the hills for the sky's bruise at storm's approach. She watches as Phoebe demonstrates the backstrap loom, its wooden frame lashed with sinew, the weaver leaning into the tension with her body weight to advance the cloth. "See here," Phoebe says, her voice rough as unsanded oak. guiding Artemis's hand to the shuttle. A smooth bone tool carved from a deer's ulna, its point filed keen to pierce the shed. The girl, goddess though she be, fumbles at first, her fingers unaccustomed to the deliberate rhythm, but soon finds the flow, her passes steadying as if echoing the arrow's flight she will one day master. The women share their yarns, tales of a winter when wolves culled half the flock, forcing them to weave nets from nettle fiber, stripped and retted in the Ladon's shallows, to trap hares in the snowfields, or the year a landslide buried the upper terraces, and they replanted with beans intercropped among the vines. The legume's nitrogen, a quiet alchemy for the soil's revival. Artemis, in turn, brings the wild's lexicon to their circle. She shows them tracks in the mud, the splayed pad of a boar, tusks gouging the earth like plowshares gone awry, the delicate imprint of a deer's cloven hoof, pointing toward the berry thickets where the does calve in secret. Under her guidance, the women venture beyond the village bounds, baskets of woven willow slung over shoulders, foraging for dittany whose leaves staunch a cut as surely as cobwebs, or cyclamen bulbs roasted in embers to ease the flux of a woman's courses. These expeditions are prosaic affairs, pauses to shift a stone from the path, lest it twist an ankle, or the shared sip from a leather flask of soured goat milk to slake the dust. Yet in Artemis's company, the woods yield more bountifully. A clutch of quail eggs nestled in leaf litter, their shells speckled like the moon's face, or a stand of asphodel whose roots, when pounded, thicken a stew against the lean months. The village men, returning with ewes heavy with wool, note the change. Fuller larders, fewer empty bellies at the evening hearth, where stories now include glimpses of a silver arrow glimpsed in the gloaming, felling a stag that provides meat for all. As autumn's first gales strip the oaks to copper skeletons, the weaving takes on new motifs under Artemis's subtle influence. The women incorporate subtle emblems, a zigzag for the lightning that cracks the ridges, or a running spiral evoking the river's meander, patterns that in time will adorn the peplos offered at her shrines. She joins their evening gatherings by the fire pit, a circle of stones ringed with milking stools, where they card wool with combs of thornwood, the fleece's lanolin scent mingling with smoke from apple boughs. Here, amid the crackle of flames fed by windfall branches, Artemis speaks of the hunt not as glory, but as necessity's edge. The way a bow's curve mirrors the spine's arch under strain, or how one reads the wind's whisper in a hare's ear twitch. The women listen, their needles pausing, and share their own survivals. The birthing of twins in a snowbound hut, sustained by broth simmered from pine inner bark, or the mending of a broken loom with splints of reed, ensuring the cloth that clothes the dead for their pyre. Yet as the nights lengthen, a subtle unease threads the air, like a snag in fresh-spun yarn. Whispers circulate of shadows in the woods, wolves bolder than usual, their howls threading the valleys like a hunter's call. The men sharpen spears of cornel wood, tipped with obsidian flakes traded from the isles, and post watches on the hill crests. Artemis, ever the liminal one, seems both cause and cure, her presence drawing the pack closer even as her gaze scatters them at need. The women wonder as they beat the woven cloth on stones smoothed by the Ladon's flow. Is this maiden a gift from the wild gods, teaching them to weave hunt into hearth, Or does she herald a unraveling, where the threads of domesticity fray against the forest's pull? And so, as you sit by the fire's dying embers, the wool's warmth against your knees, you ponder. In the quiet warp of Arcadian days, what patterns does Artemis begin to shuttle through, binding the village to the wild's inexorable rhythm, or loosening it thread by thread? You settle deeper into the rhythm of Chaeronea as autumn's chill begins to thread the air, turning the Ladon's waters to a sharper clarity where trout dart like silver shuttles beneath the surface. The oaks, their leaves curling at the edges like the hems of worn chitons, drop acorns in a steady patter that the women gather in woven hampers, their skirts brushing the leaf litter as they stoop. Life in the village persists in its unhurried cadence. The men return from the high pastures with ewes whose bells clank discordantly, wool matted with burrs that must be picked free by lantern light. The boys practice slinging stones at makeshift targets of stacked turf, their misses thudding into the earth like half-hearted omens. Artemis, now a fixture in the weaving circle, moves among them with the unobtrusive grace of a stream finding its channel, neither commanding nor retreating, but simply there, her presence a quiet warp against which the day's weft is drawn. The women's gatherings evolve under her subtle tutelage, shifting from mere labor to a shared lexicon of the wild's intricacies. You join them at the communal loom house, a low structure of wattle and daub with a roof of thatch that leaks in the first rains, forcing them to shift the frames beneath clay pots placed to catch the drips. Phoebe, ever the anchor, demonstrates the carding of fleeces on combs spiked with hawthorn thorns, the wool transforming from tangled clumps to fluffy clouds that catch the light filtering through the smoke hole. Artemis observes, then contributes. She brings fleeces from the forest's edge, gathered from brambles where sheep have rubbed against the thorns, the wool already softened by dew and the nibble of browsing deer. Feel the difference, she says, her voice even as the rivers flow, pressing a lock into Lycia's palm, the fiber finer, less prone to felting in the wash. The women experiment, blending it into their yarns, the resulting thread holding dye more evenly, yielding cloaks that repel the winter's damp like oiled leather. These innovations are tested in the mundane. A herder wears one on a scouting trip to the upper ridges, returning to report how it warded off the sleet that plastered his old garment. The water beading and rolling away, like beads from a broken necklace. Context deepens as the season turns, revealing Arcadia's layered history in the very tools they wield. The looms themselves, heirlooms passed through bloodlines thinned by fevers and falls, bear the marks of earlier eras, pegs worn smooth from the fingers of grandmothers who had fled the Dorian migrations, hiding in the ravines with bundles of undyed yarn clutched to their breasts. Leto's tales, carried on Artemis's lips, interlace with these. Stories of the Titan hunts, where nets were woven from spider silk gathered at dawn, invisible until the quarry tangled in their embrace. The women listen as they ply the spindle, the whir a counterpoint to her words, and adapt. They experiment with nettle fibers stripped from the riverbanks, retted in ash lye baths that bubble softly over the hearth, producing chords strong enough for snares that claim conies without waste. One evening, as the fire spits from resinous pine knots. Artemis recounts a forgotten rite from the island cradles, how maidens in Delos bound their hair with willow withes to invoke the moon's clarity in their sight. And the women try it, twisting supple branches into fillets that, when worn on a foraging run, seem to sharpen their eyes to the quiver of a partridge's wing beneath the ferns. Daily survival strategies unfold in tandem, the hunt weaving into the hearth's routines like a recurring motif. The village faces a lean spell as the first frosts blacken the late greens, the stored lentils sprouting mold in the damp pits lined with straw. Artemis leads small parties, never more than 4 to avoid startling the game, into the bordering woods, teaching the art of reading the land's signs. The way moss clings thicker on the north sides of oaks, indicating sheltered glades where pheasants roost. Or the faint scrape of antler on bark, signaling a stag's rut that draws the does into predictable paths. You accompany one such foray, your breath fogging in the crisp air as you crest a ridge where the maquis gives way to a hollow of chestnuts, their husks split open like secrets revealed. The bows they carry are simple affairs, yew staves tillered by the village elder, strung with twisted flax and tipped with arrowheads of chipped chert, napped with antler tools that leave a faint sheen on the edges. Artemis demonstrates the draw, not with flourish, but with the economy of necessity, her shoulders rolling back as the string aligns with her anchor point at the jaw's corner. The release a whisper that sends the shaft arcing true to pin a hair mid-leap, its form crumpling without undue suffering. Back at the village, the processing is a communal rite of efficiency. Skins scraped clean of flesh with bone scrapers curved like the moon's sickle, stretched on frames of split hazel to dry by the hearth's warmth. Meat portioned into haunches seared over coals. The fat rendered into lamps that burn with a steady, acrid flame through the lengthening nights. The women incorporate these yields into their weaving lore. Tendons from the hairs twisted into the finest threads for embroidery, dyed with walnut hulls foraged from the river's bends, creating borders on tunics that depict running stags, their lines fluid as the Ladon's current. Personal stories surface in these tasks, binding the group tighter. Lycia speaks of her brother's loss to a boar charge 3 winters past, how the men had tracked it for days, surviving on dew wrung from moss and berries pulped in their mouths, only to find the beast turned to dust in a lightning-struck hollow. A tale that tempers their snares with caution, each set baited with just enough apple cores to lure without excess. Phoebe shares the quieter endurance of her widowhood, weaving alone through miscarriages that left her hands idle until the circle's rhythm pulled her back, thread by thread. As the leaves blanket the paths in a coppery hush, tensions from the encroaching wild begin to knot. The wolves, drawn by the scent of fresh kills hung to age in the smokehouse, test the village's edges more boldly. Paw prints circle the goat pens at dawn, the mud churned like a poorly heddled cloth. The men reinforce the folds with stakes driven deep into the frozen ground, their mallets thudding a somber beat. While Artemis advises on diversions, scattering wolf scat gathered from the high trails to mark territory, or burning bundles of artemisia whose sharp smoke confuses the pack's noses. Yet incidents mount. A ewe dragged off in the gloaming, its bleat cut short, leaving only wool tufts snagged on thorns like warnings unheeded. The village elders convene by the central olive, its trunk scarred from axes spared in lean years, debating whether to petition the seer at Tegea for oracles, or to mount a cull with torches and spears that risk drawing more beasts from the dark. Artemis navigates this fraying with her characteristic poise, joining the watches where she perches on outcrops, her silhouette merging with the rocks as she looses warning shots that crack branches overhead, scattering the shadows without spill. The women, emboldened, weave protective talismans, small pouches of wolfsbane roots and deer's knucklebones, strung on cords to hang at the thresholds, their scents a barrier as subtle as moonlight on frost. In the loom house, patterns shift. The spirals tighten into labyrinths, evoking the wolf's circuitous prowl. Threads of black-dyed wool from the forest fleeces outlining jaws agape. Leto's echoes persist in Artemis's counsel, the balance of predator and prey as the gods' own weave, where overhunting thins the herd that sustains the hunt. The village adapts, rationing the new meats into stews simmered with foraged roots, the broth stretched with barley from the last sound silo, shared in wooden bowls passed around the fire pit, where flames leap like startled hares. Through these deepening days, the narrative draws toward a crux, the wild's threads pulling taut against the domestic loom. The women sense it in the loom's creak under heavier warps, in the way Artemis's gaze lingers longer on the tree line at dusk. As a bitter wind strips the last leaves, heralding the first true snows that will blanket the ridges, a larger shadow stirs. Reports from passing traders of a great boar ravaging the lowlands, its tusks goring vines and men alike, fleeing northward into Arcadian folds. The village braces, sharpening their tools with whetstones oiled in linseed pressed from the summer's flax, wondering if this is the unraveling or the knot that binds. But as you huddle by the loom, the shuttles pass echoing the wind's whine through the thatch. A question coils like unplied yarn. Will Artemis guide them to weave this encroaching peril into sustenance, a hunt that fortifies the circle? Or will the wild's howl snap the threads, leaving the village to unravel in the winter's grip? Winter's first grip tightens on Chaeronea like a poorly tensioned warp, the snows blanketing the ridges in a hush, broken only by the muffled crunch under booted feet. The Ladon freezes in patches along its shallows, ice veining the surface like cracks in a fired pot, while the village hunkers inward, smoke curling from the thatch roofs in lazy spirals that the wind twists into fleeting shapes. You huddle in the loom house, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and the faint char of peat dug from the boggy lowlands, fuel that burns slow and hot, eked out through the long nights. The boar's shadow looms larger now, its depredations filtering down from traders' tales, vineyards in the vales below trampled to ruin, its tusks carving gashes in the trunks of fig trees, heavy with unripe fruit, and men felled in the fields, their wounds festering like unspoken grudges. The village elders, faces lined like the bark of ancient cork oaks, gather by the central fire pit, its embers banked under ash to preserve the heat, debating the cull with voices low as the river's winter murmur. Artemis, undimmed by the season's pallor, becomes the quiet axis around which preparations turn. She moves through the snow-dusted paths with purpose, her cloak a patchwork of hides stitched with sinew threads the women have taught her to waterproof by rubbing in beeswax rendered from the last hive's combs. The loom house serves as command, its walls hung with half-finished webs that now bear charts of the beast's trail, sketched in charcoal on scraps of linen, lines tracing its northward flight through ravines marked by uprooted saplings and scat like scattered obsidian. Phoebe and Lycia, their fingers chapped from the cold's bite, adapt their craft to the need. Weaving slings from braided nettle cord, pouches weighted with river stones smoothed by eons of current, tested by flinging at bundled straw that mimics the boar's bulk. Tighter here, Artemis instructs, her touch light on the knot, ensuring the loop holds without chafing the wrist. A detail born of the wild's unforgiving arithmetic, where a loose bind means a missed throw and an empty pot. The climax builds not in a thunder of horns, but in the incremental forging of resolve, the village's resilience distilled into the hunt's stark necessities. Dawn breaks gray and grudging on the appointed day. The sky a slate washed clean by night winds that have swept the snow into drifts waist-high on the leeward slopes. The party assembles at the village's edge, 8 souls bundled in layers of wool and leather, their breaths pluming like libations to the frost gods. The men carry spears hafted in ash, tips quenched in linseed oil to prevent rust from the damp. The women, including you, bear the woven snares and baskets for the yield, plus poultices of yarrow packed in waxed cloth to staunch any wounds. Artemis leads, her tracks light and sure, reading the snow's script. The boar's churned furrows where it rooted for tubers frozen shallow. The steam from its breath long dissipated, but the melt patterns telling of a turn toward the chestnut hollows. The trek consumes the morning, pauses marked by sips from goatskin flasks of mulled wine thinned with water, spiced with cinnamon traded from distant ports. Its warmth a bulwark against the numb that creeps into extremities. As the sun claws higher, feeble through the overcast, they crest the ridge into the hollow, a bowl of white rimmed by skeletal trees whose branches claw the air like unfinished shuttles. The boar is there, a massive form of brindled hide and yellowed tusks, rooting at the base of a fallen oak, its grunts echoing off the snow like the scrape of a loom's beater. Panic flickers. A young herder's foot slips on glare ice, sending a pebble skittering that alerts the beast, its head snapping up, small eyes red as embers in the gloom. But Artemis's voice cuts the moment, calm as a spindle's drop. Circle wide, use the wind's quarter. The party fans out, movements deliberate, boots planted to avoid the crust's betrayals. She signals with a raised fist, and the slings whir, stones arcing in a ragged volley that thud against the beast's shoulders, drawing a bellow that shakes loose powder from the boughs. It charges, tusks lowered like plowshares, toward the nearest man. But the woven snare deploys. Lycia, hands steady from years at the heddle, loops it over a foreleg, the nettle cord biting deep as the boar thrashes, entangling itself in the mesh that the women had reinforced with boar bristle from prior kills. The struggle resolves in a gritty ballet of survival, the snow churned to slush under the frenzy. Spears jab to keep distance, tips glancing off the hide thickened by winter fat, while Artemis looses her arrows, fletched with goose veins plucked from the river's migrants, shafts of cornel straight as the loom's beam, into the flanks. Each strike precise to cripple without waste. You witness it close, the acrid reek of the beast's musk mingling with the metallic tang of blood welling hot and dark, staining the white. A tusk grazes Phoebe's calf, tearing cloth and flesh in a shallow furrow, but she binds it swiftly with her own woven bandage, the yarrow's bitterness staunching the flow as they close the net. The boar weakens, its lungs heaving clouds of vapor, until a final spear, thrust by the elder with a grunt born of decades' grudges, pierces the throat, the body slumping into the reddened drift like a felled tapestry. The aftermath is labor, not triumph. The carcass field dressed with flint knives, entrails steaming in the cold as they spill the offal to the crows, a ritual nod to the cycle's turn. The men quarter the meat, haunches wrapped in hides to haul back on improvised litters of lashed poles, while the women salvage the hide, scraping it clean on the spot with mussel shells pried from the Ladon's banks in summer. Tusks are extracted, curved ivory that will be carved into loom weights or amulets, their heft a reminder of the peril transmuted. Artemis oversees the division, ensuring portions for the village's widows and the infirm, her portions smallest, a haunch for the dogs, a strip of flank for her own fire. The return trek drags through the afternoon, the load heavy but the air lighter, conversation threading through the exertion, jests about the boar's temper matching old Creos's, or plans for the fat rendered into soap that will cleanse the spring silt. Back in Chaeronea, the yield weaves into the community's sinews. The loom house fills with the scent of curing meat, strips hung from the rafters like banners of endurance, smoked over alder chips that impart a subtle earthiness to the flesh. The women process the hide, tanning it in a pit of oak bark decoction, its tannins drawn from galls gathered in autumn, the brew stirred daily with paddles of willow to even the soak, yielding leather supple enough for new soles on worn sandals or linings for cloaks against the next gale. Tusks become tools, one hollowed for a spindle whirl, its curve fitting the thumb's grip perfectly, spinning yarn finer than before. Stories proliferate around the hearths, where the meat simmers in pots of clay fired in the village kiln, stews thickened with blood flour, and foraged nettles blanched to tame their sting, binding the hunt into lore. How the snare held because Lycia's knot echoed the river's bend, or Artemis's arrow found its mark by reading the snow's sheen like a weft's gloss. This resolution ripples outward, fortifying the village against winter's deeper siege. The wolves, scenting the blood on the wind, circle closer but falter at the boar's reek smeared on the pen's thresholds, a ward of fat and musk that confounds their trails. The elders decree a weaving festival come the thaw, cloths offered at the wild olive's fork to Artemis, their patterns now labyrinths resolved into hunts triumphant. Personal arcs close in quiet ways, Phoebe's wound scars faintly, a line like a shuttle's path, reminding her of the circle's strength. The young herder, chastened by his slip, apprentices to the bowyer, tillering staves with newfound patience. Artemis lingers through the snows, her teachings embedded in the routines. The way forays now scan for snares' signs, or yarns blend wild fibers for durability untested before. As spring's tentative greens pierce the melt, the ladon swelling with runoff that carries the last ice flecks like forgotten threads. Chaeronea emerges woven tighter, the hunts echo in every pass of the shuttle. You trace the new patterns on a finished cloak, the boar's form stylized in ochre dyes from clay pits, a motif that will travel with traders to distant hearths. In this Arcadian crucible, Artemis reveals the wild not as adversary, but as the loom's unseen tension, the pull that straightens the cloth of survival, binding human frailty to the land's inexorable weave. Ponder, then, as the river's thaw song rises, in our era of unraveling edges, where cities encroach on forests like ill-spaced heddles, does Artemis's lesson endure, that resilience blooms not from conquest's flash, but from the patient knotting of peril into provision, threading the ordinary into the eternal. Envision the marshy fringes of Attica, where the Euripos straight funnels its brackish currents into the shallow lagoons of Brauron, a coastal plain hemmed by the low hills of the Mesogaia that rise like the rumpled folds of a shepherd's cloak discarded at day's end. It is early spring, the air laced with the mineral tang of tidal mud and the faint, green sharpness of budding plane trees along the paths. Brauron, in the era when the Athenian democracy still teetered on the edge of its classical poise, perhaps during the archonship of some forgotten eponymos around 430 BCE, when the Peloponnesian War's shadow lengthened but had not yet choked the olive groves, was no grand sanctuary of white marble and incense-heavy altars. It was a practical wetland, where fishermen poled flat-bottomed boats through reed-choked channels to gill nets heavy with mullet, their hulls gutted on the shore under the relentless gaze of gulls wheeling in thermals off the sea. The soil here, a mix of clay and silt deposited by the river's sluggish flow, supported neither vast fields nor easy vintages. Instead, it yielded to the rhythms of salt marsh and scrub, where women gathered samphire for pickling in brine jars sealed with olive wood plugs, or harvested the tough rushes that served as the village's primary weave for mats and sandals. You walk these paths now, your feet sinking slightly into the soft earth, the distant bleat of goats from the upland pastures carrying on the breeze like a half-remembered melody. The core of Brauron's life pulsed in the sanctuary's modest precinct, a cluster of structures half swallowed by the marsh. The temple, a simple Doric edifice of local limestone whose triglyphs bore the patina of salt spray, surrounding stoas where initiates sheltered during rites, their roofs of terracotta tiles cracked from winter frosts and mended with lime mortar mixed from oyster shells burned in kilns fed by driftwood. This was the domain of Artemis Brauronia, the goddess as tender of transitions, her cult rooted in the island's ancient Pelasgian whispers, but codified by Ionian settlers who brought tales of the wild maiden from Delos. The priestesses, women past the blush of youth, their hair bound in kerchiefs stained with woad from the Attic hills, oversaw the Arcadia, the bear dance of the Maidens, not as spectacle, but as a measured passage from girlhood's frayed edges to the weave of womanly duties. Life here demanded the quiet arts of adaptation. Cisterns dug deep to capture rainwater that the porous ground drank greedily, lined with pitch from pine resins boiled in copper cauldrons, or the careful tending of sacred bears, domesticated cubs from the mountains, their pelts shedding in spring to be carded into talismanic threads for the girls' saffron-dyed tunics. Into this liminal world arrive the Maidens, a cohort of some 20 girls aged 10 to 12, summoned from Athenian households by the Archon's decree. Their arrival staggered over weeks to ease the sanctuary's stores. You are among the attendants, perhaps a younger sister or a village helper. Your hands rough from helping your mother twist willow into baskets at home. Now tasked with carrying the girls' small bundles. Folded chitons of linen too fine for marshware. Wrapped around barley cakes baked in domed ovens and stamped with the family's seal of a stylized owl. The maidens themselves are ordinary in their uncertainties. Callisto, with freckles like scattered lentils across her nose. From a potter's family in the Kerameikos, her fingers perpetually dusted with slip from the wheel. Or Irene, slight as a reed, daughter of a fuller whose days were spent treading wool in vats of stale urine to set the dyes. They arrive by cart or on foot along the sacred way, the road rutted from ox wagons hauling amphorae of oil to the harbor at Rhamnus, their chatter subdued by the journey's jostle and the weight of what awaits. A season of seclusion, fasting, and mimicry of the bear's wild gait, all to appease Artemis's transitional gaze. The Rite's prelude unfolds in the everyday grind of preparation, the sanctuary's routines a scaffold for the soul's subtle shift. The priestesses assign the girls to the stoas, low benches of sun-baked brick where they sleep on pallets stuffed with dried asphodel. The stem's faint vanilla scent warding off the marsh's midges that swarm at dusk. Mornings begin with the ablutions, a procession to the sacred spring, its waters tepid from the earth's embrace, where the maidens strip to their waists and anoint themselves with oil mixed from wild olives pressed in stone mortars. The residue scraped from the girl's skin with strigils of smoothed bone to symbolize shedding the child's unformed clay. You assist, pouring the measured allotments from clay jugs balanced on your hip. The liquids glug a rhythmic counterpoint to the priestess's chants, invocations in the old Attic dialect, beseeching Artemis to guard the blood's first flow, that crimson thread binding girl to woman. Meals are sparse, designed to mimic the bear's lean seasons, porridge of barley ground in hand querns, its grit a reminder of the earth's unyielding gift, flavored with foraged sorrel, whose oxalic bite sharpens the tongue like a whetstone on bronze. As days lengthen toward the full moon's rise, the Arctea's core emerges in the dance's incremental rehearsals, held in the precinct's open court, where the ground is tamped flat with mallets wielded by the sanctuary's laborers, men from the nearby hamlets, their tunics belted with leather from the goats they herd. The girls, clad in those saffron crocuses sewn from wool carded loose to evoke the bear's shaggy coat, learn the steps not from scrolls or flutes, but from the priestess's patient demonstrations, a slow, swaying prowl on all fours across the dust, mimicking the cub's tentative exploration. Then the upright shuffle, arms curved like forepaws, heads tossing to shake imaginary dew from manes that are merely braids loosened with combs of boxwood. Callisto stumbles at first, her knees buckling on the uneven clay, scraping palms that the attendants bind with strips of linen soaked in vinegar to prevent festering, a common hazard in the damp, where infections spread like rumors through the close quarters. Irene, more lithe, captures the rhythm swiftly, her movements echoing the otters that slip through the lagoons at dawn. But she tires quickly, her breaths coming in wheezes that prompt the priestesses to teach breathing from the belly, as if drawing the marsh's own tides inward. The sanctuary's women weave these lessons into the broader tapestry of survival, sharing the hidden lore that sustains the rite's sanctity. Evenings gather them by the hearth in the priestess house, a structure of mud brick with walls frescoed faintly in ochre swirls depicting running stags, where they shell peas gathered from the upland plots, pods split with thumbnails yellowed from the task, the seeds boiled with dill from the herb beds to stretch the evening's pottage. Here, stories flow like the Europos's current. One priestess recounts a rite from her girlhood when a summer drought shrank the spring to a seep, forcing them to trek to the Ilissos for water carried in amphorae lashed to donkeys, the weight bowing their spines like the bears under winter's load. Another speaks of a maiden who, during the dance, twisted an ankle on a loose pebble, mended with splints of reed and rest by the fire, emerging with a limp that became her mark of Artemis's favor, a subtle asymmetry that guided her later steps as a midwife in Athens. These narratives, dull in their domesticity, underscore the rite's essence, not divine frenzy, but the measured endurance of thresholds, where the body's awkward shifts mirror the soul's quiet realignments. The maidens absorb this, their play tempered by the sanctuary's bounds. They forage under supervision along the marsh edges, baskets filling with mussels pried from the pilings of old fish weirs, shells cracked open with stones to reveal the briny flesh, steamed in their own liquor over tripod pots to test for poison before consumption. Artemis's presence infuses these tasks subtly. A sudden rustle in the reeds reveals a vixen with kits, their eyes like polished amber, teaching the girls the art of stillness, or the unexpected bloom of crocuses carpeting the court after a night rain, petals plucked for garlands that crown the dancers' brows during practice. The priestesses note the omens in the mundane, a bear cub's unusually calm demeanor as it laps from the spring, or the way the gull's cries align with the girl's chants, as if the birds echo the goddess's unseen approval. Yet as the moon fattens, casting its pallor over the lagoons where frogs chorus in counterpoint to the distant waves, a undercurrent of unease stirs the reeds. Whispers circulate among the attendants of a prior rite marred by ill fortune, a maiden taken by marsh fever, her fever dreams filled with wolves circling the stoas, her passing marked by the priestess's hurried burial under a cairn of river stones. The girls sense it in the lengthening shadows, their dances growing hesitant, steps faltering as if the ground itself withholds its firmness. The priestesses redouble the offerings, loaves baked with honey from wild hives, their crusts imprinted with bear paws pressed in the dough, poured at the altar's base. But the air hangs heavier, laced with the premonition of transition's sharper edge. And so, as you kneel by the spring at twilight, the water's surface rippling with the moon's reflection, fractured like a maiden's resolve, you contemplate, in the hushed prelude of Brauron's Rite, what echoes does Artemis awaken in these girls' tentative steps, guiding them toward womanhood's weave, or luring them toward the wild's unresolved howl? You linger in the sanctuary's court, as the full moon's glow begins to silver the reed fringes, turning the marsh into a mosaic of shadow and shimmer where the Europos's tides lap with a soft, insistent murmur. The air cools now, carrying the night's damp that settles on your skin like a fine mist from the spring's overflow, and the maidens' rehearsals draw to their close. The girls collapsing onto the tamped earth in heaps of saffron wool, their breaths ragged but laced with the tentative thrill of mastery. Brauron's rhythms deepen in this phase, the Rite's middle stretch where the Arcadia's steps evolve from mimicry to meditation, the body learning to hold the bear's wild poise amid the sanctuary's ordered confines. The priestesses, their faces etched with the subtle lines of seasons spent in this liminal service, guide the progression with the patience of those who know transitions wait. Not a leap, but a gradual settling, like silt in the lagoon after a storm's churn. The days unfold in a tighter weave of discipline and disclosure. The girls' routines calibrated to the moon's wax and wane, each phase a thread pulling them further from childhood's loose ends. Mornings still summon them to the spring, but now the ablutions include a ritual scraping with the strigils, not just of oil, but of a paste ground from white clay dug from the riverbanks, kaolin mixed with crushed myrtle leaves. Its astringency meant to tighten the pores as surely as it steels the will against the flux to come. You help mix it in shallow bowls of baked clay, the pestle of olive wood thudding rhythmically against the sides, releasing the herb's bitter aroma that clings to your fingers through the afternoon. Callisto, her freckles standing out sharper against the pallor of fatigue, winces at the paste's chill but endures, the priestess murmuring, as the bear grooms her coat against the bramble's tear, so you prepare the skin for life's pricks. The water that follows is measured now, ladled from the spring's basin with shells of whelk, each girl allotted just enough to rinse without waste. For the cisterns run low in this brackish season, their levels marked by notches on the stone rim that the attendants tally daily with knotted cords. The dances intensify, shifting from the court's flat expanse to the marsh's yielding edges, where the ground gives like a living thing underfoot, training the ankles to flex against uncertainty. The priestesses lead the processions at midday, when the sun's heat draws steam from the mudflats, veiling the air in a haze that blurs the horizon where sea meets sky. The girls, their saffron tunics cropped short to free the limbs, form a loose arc along the reed beds, the sacred bears, 2 yearlings this season, their muzzles scarred from rough play with siblings left in the hills, padding alongside on leashes of braided rush. Irene takes to this terrain with ease, her reed-slim form adapting to the suck of mud that pulls at the heels, her paws mimicking the cub's waddle with a shuffle that sends ripples through the shallows. But Callisto falters, her potter's stance too rooted, knees locking as if molded to the wheel. A slip sends her sprawling into the ooze, the cold sludge seeping through her wool like a baptism unwanted. The attendants pull her up, you among them, wiping the mud with handfuls of dry grass plucked from the higher banks, then binding a twisted ankle with strips of linen from the sanctuary's stores, cloth salvaged from old peplos, boiled in lye to purify and softened with olive oil kneaded in by fistfuls. These mishaps become lessons in the rite's deeper lore, the priestesses weaving tales around the hearth as evenings draw the circle inward. The fire pit, ringed with stones polished smooth by generations of heels, crackles with driftwood gathered from the tide line. Splinters of pine wash down from the Mesogaia's slopes, their resin popping like questions unanswered. Suppers are communal. Pots of earthenware simmered over the flames with eels caught in basket traps woven from osier withes, their flesh flaky and laced with salt from the evaporated pans along the shore. As the girls portion the meal with bone spoons carved from sheep scapulae, the stories unfold. One priestess recalls a cohort from her youth when a fever swept the stoas, claiming 3 maidens in deliriums where they pawed the air as if fending spectral wolves. The survivors, dosed with decoctions of willow bark stripped and pounded fresh, emerged with a keener sense of the body's fragility. Their dances thereafter infused with a deliberate slowness that honored the lost. Another speaks of the sanctuary's hidden cistern, a vaulted chamber beneath the temple floor accessed by a trapdoor of fitted slabs, its walls sealed with hydraulic lime from volcanic ash traded from the islands. A reservoir dug in the droughts of old, its water tasting of stone and endurance, rationed in the rite to teach the throat's quiet ache. Artemis's echoes resonate through these narratives, her presence not in thunder, but in the rite's subtle symmetries, the way the bear's grunts harmonize with the girl's chants, low vowels drawn from the diaphragm to mimic the marsh's hidden burble. The maidens begin to internalize it, their play in the stoas evolving, games of tag through the pillars, but with rules bent to the bear's gait, pursuits that end not in capture, but in shared collapse, laughter bubbling like the spring's overflow. You observe from the edges, mending a torn tunic with needle of bronze and thread of flax, spun coarse for the task. As Callisto leads an impromptu circle, her bandaged ankle propped on a stool of cork bark, directing the others in a chant of her own devising, syllables evoking the reed's sway, the mud's reluctant yield. The priestesses approve subtly, nodding as they grind pigments for the girls' markings, ochre from the clay pits mixed with bear fat rendered in small crucibles, daubed in spirals on cheeks and shoulders to symbolize the pelt's first growth, the paste's warmth a fleeting comfort against the night's chill. Survival's strategies surface in the sanctuary's margins, binding the rite to Brauron's unyielding pulse. The marsh yields its own curriculum, foraging parties at dawn, when the mist clings low and the crabs scuttle sideways across the flats, their shells cracked with flat stones to yield meat for baiting the eel traps. The girls learn to identify the safe from the treacherous. Samfire's fleshy tips snapped clean for salads dressed in vinegar from the wine lees, or the avoidant of hemlock whose umbels nod like false promises, its roots a poison that twists the gut like an ill-tied knot. Irene excels here, her fuller's heritage lending her a nose for the foul, spotting the milkweed's veined leaves that blister the tongue if boiled amiss. These halls supplement the stores, mussels steamed in baskets suspended over boiling water drawn from the cistern, their shells pried with iron awls forged in the village smithy, the liquor saved to thin the porridges that follow. Personal vignettes thread through, shared in the quiet of bandage changes or loom repairs, the stoa's weaving frames, vertical warps of linen stretched between posts, where the girls practice simple bands for their hair, shuttles of bone passing under the priestess's watchful eyes. One maiden, a quiet girl from the Piraeus with salt-crusted lashes, confesses a fear of the sea's pull, her father lost to a squall that capsized his trading skiff. The Rite, she says, grounds her, the mud's grip a counter to the wave's caprice. As the moon holds its fullness for 3 nights, the dances crest in the precinct under open sky. The court ringed by torches of rush dipped in pitch, their flames guttering in the offshore breeze that carries the scent of kelp from the strait. The bears are loosed to prowl the edges, their shadows elongated like omens on the walls, while the girls circle inward, steps sinking to the beat of tambourines stretched with goatskin thrummed by knuckles calloused from the querns. The chants rise, layered harmonies invoking Artemis's grace, the virgin's vigilance over the threshold, her arrows not for slaying, but for warding the blood's untimely spill. Yet fractures appear. Callisto's ankle swells anew, forcing her to the sidelines where she beats time with a stick of plane wood, her frustration etching lines on her young brow. Irene, pushing too far in the heat, collapses mid-prowl, her wheeze a rasp that summons the priestesses with infusions of hyssop steeped in the spring's flow, its steam easing the spasm like a mother's hand on fevered flesh. The sanctuary braces as the rite nears its zenith, offerings mounting at the altar. Locks of the girl's hair shorn with shears of iron tempered in the sea, coiled into nests for the bear's bedding, or small effigies of clay, molded with thumbs dipped in the mud, baked in the hearth's dying coals to harden like resolve. Whispers of the prior fever's ghost persist, the attendants burning bundles of artemisia at the stoa's thresholds, its smoke a veil against unseen ills. The priestesses consult the omens in the mundane, a crab's claw found intact in the mussel shell, curving like the moon's sickle, or the sudden piping of plovers over the lagoon, their calls aligning with the dance's cadence. Artemis seems nearer in these signs, her wild guardianship threading the girl's forms. But the air thickens with the threshold's tension, the marsh's frogs falling silent as if holding breath. But as you stand vigil by the torchlight, the flames dance mirroring the maiden's faltering grace. A query stirs like silt unsettled. In the deepening echoes of Brauron's Rite, will Artemis bind these girls to the weave of womanly endurance, their steps firming into the dance of survival? Or will the wild's call fracture the circle, drawing one into the moonlit reeds where transitions turn treacherous? The moon's 3rd night crests in Brauron, its light a steady argent flood that turns the marsh's labyrinth of channels into veins of molten silver, pulsing with the Europos's relentless inward-outward sigh. You stand at the court's periphery, the torch flames now mere accents to the lunar glow, their pitch smoke threading upward like unanswered prayers caught in the night's breath. The air hums with the rite's culmination, the Arcadia's climax where the maiden's steps must bridge the chasm between emulation and embodiment, the bear's wild essence imprinting on the soul like a dye set in the fuller's vat. The sanctuary holds its collective inhale, the priestesses arrayed in their kerchiefs of undyed linen, hands clasped over staves topped with bronze antlers that catch the light in faint, flickering warnings. This is the resolution's forge, where transitions are tempered not in isolation, but in the circle's unyielding hold, the quiet alchemy that turns girls' hesitations into women's measured strides. The dance erupts from the shadows, the girls spilling into the court like spilled quicksilver. Their saffron forms a whirl of paws and prows under the moon's impartial eye. The sacred bears, leashes slipped in this hallowed hour, circle the edges with deliberate snorts, their bulk a living boundary that the maidens must navigate, steps sinking to the tambourine's deepened thrum, skins stretched tauter now, beaten with fists wrapped in wool to muffle the bruise. Callisto, her ankle braced with a splint of reed lashed firm with rush cords, leads from the center. Her limp transformed into a deliberate sway that echoes the bear's cautious favor on uneven ground. The ochre spirals on her cheeks, smeared by sweat, streak like war paint from a hunt unbloodied. Irene flanks her, breaths steadied by the hyssop's lingering balm, her shuffle fluid as the lagoons slip, arms carving arcs that part the air with a hush akin to arrows loosed in mist. The chants swell, layered vowels invoking Artemis's dual grace. The huntress who spares the fawn yet guards the whelp, her gaze a thread binding the Rite's frayed potentials into wholeness. The climax fractures in the dance's heat, a moment of raw convergence where the wild asserts its claim. As the circle tightens, the plovers piping crescendos overhead, their wings slicing the night like shears through warp. And one bear, a young male with a ruff thickened by the season's molt, lunges not in threat but in mimicry, rearing to paw the air in echo of the girl's toss. Panic ripples. A maiden from the Piraeus stumbles backward into the reeds, her cry sharp as a snapped shuttle, thorns snagging her tunic in a tear that bears a shoulder pale as the moonstruck mud. The circle holds, barely, the priestess's voices rising in counterpoint, a dirge-like harmony drawn from the old Pelasgian roots, beseeching the goddess to weave the breach. You rush forward with the attendants, a pouch of linen slung at your belt holding the yarrow compresses. But Callisto pivots, her bandaged foot planting firm in the yielding earth, extending an arm curved like a forepaw to steady the fallen girl. Irene circles wide, herding the bear back with a low growl learned from the cub's play, the sound rumbling from her chest like the marsh's subterranean burble. Resolution settles in the aftermath's meticulous care, the dance dissolving into a tableau of exhausted forms sprawled across the court. The moon's light pooling in the hollows of their collars as breaths slow to the tide's cadence. The priestesses move among them, anointing brows with oil from a horn ladle. Wild olive blended with myrrh resin dissolved in the spring's flow, its viscosity a balm that seals the night's exertions like wax on a scroll. The fallen maiden's tear is mended on the spot, needle flashing in the torchlight, to stitch the saffron wool with threads of flax dyed in the sanctuary's vats. The repair a crooked seam that will become her keepsake, a tangible echo of the threshold crossed. The bear, calmed with handfuls of dried figs pressed from the upland groves, is leashed anew, its tongue rasping over a priestess's palm in what passes for truce. Suppers follow in the stoas, the rites fast broken with ritual precision. Eel broth simmered long over banked embers, strained through cheesecloth woven by prior cohorts to remove the bones, sipped from kylixes of clay whose lips are chipped from uncounted uses. the liquid's warmth threading through limbs gone numb from the dance's chill. In the days that trail the moon's wane, the sanctuary exhales into closure. The maiden's transformations etched in the ordinary recommitments to Brauron's pulse. The ablutions revert to simplicity, strigils scraping away the ochre remnants with olive oil warmed in sun-baked bowls. The girls' skins emerging cleaner, as if sloughed of more than paste. Weavings resume on the stoa's frames, bands now finished with borders of bear-paw motifs incised in the weft, simple herringbones twisted to evoke the print's pad, dyed in the mud's own sepia drawn from the lagoon's depths. Callisto, her ankle easing under poultices of mud packed and sun-dried, teaches the younger attendants the knot that holds the splint, a half-hitch learned from the fisherman's lines, ensuring it tightens with pull but yields to rest. Irene, her wheeze faded to a faint echo, leads foraging at dawn, baskets filling with the first samphire shoots tenderized by the night's dew, their snap under teeth a affirmation of renewal. The Piraeus girl, her scar a faint line like a river's faded meander, shares her sea fear in the hearth circle, the group responding with tales of the Euripos' treacheries, the strait that reverses thrice daily, trapping boats in its caprice, navigated by pilots who read the gulls' dives for the shift. The Rite's outcomes ripple through the sanctuary's sinews, fortifying its guardians against the marsh's perennial sieges. The prior fever's shadow lifts, the Artemisia bundles ashes scattered at the spring to renew the ward, and the cohort's vitality seems to infuse the bears. The cubs, frisking with renewed vigor in their pens of wattle fence reinforced with stakes driven by mallets thudding like the tambourine's memory. Offerings culminate at the altar. The hairlocks burned in a brazier of perforated clay, their smoke curling skyward in spirals that the priestesses read as approvals, coiling tight for favor. The clay effigies, now cracked from the hearth's kiss, buried at the temple's base in a pit lined with oyster shells for drainage, their forms dissolving back to mud as the girls depart. Personal closures weave in. The potter's daughter Callisto pockets a shard from the court's tamped floor, its edge glazed by footfalls, to embed in her family's kiln back home, a talisman for vessels fired true. Irene binds a reed from the dance's edge into her drop spindle, its flex a reminder of the body's bend without break. As the cohort disperses along the sacred way, carts creaking under bundles of laundered saffron now folded neat as resolved patterns. Brauron quiets to its baseline hum, the fishermen poling anew through the channels, nets mended with knots echoing the Rite's half-hitches. The priestesses tally the stores, cistern levels notched higher from the spring's post-Rite surge, silos of barley unspoiled by the damp's creep. Artemis's guardianship lingers in the transformed maidens, their steps carrying the bear's poise into Athenian hearths, midwives who soothe labors with the dance's sway, weavers whose shuttles mimic the paw's prowl. You wave from the precinct's gate, the sea's horizon unbroken, the marsh's frogs resuming their chorus, as if the moon's vigil were but a breath held. Reflect then, as the tide turns outward once more, carrying echoes to the deep. In our age of hurried passages, where thresholds blur in the rush of screens and streets, does Artemis's Rite at Brauron whisper that true crossing lies in the circle's patient hold? The mud's grip, the paw's imprint, the quiet mending of what the wild would tear, weaving girlhood's fray into the enduring cloth of becoming. Transport yourself to the tangled fringes of Thrace, where the Haemus mountains shoulder against the Thracian plain like the gnarled knuckles of some primordial hand. Their slopes cloaked in beech and oak that whisper secrets to the ceaseless wind off the Black Sea. It is deep autumn, the leaves turning to shades of bruised copper and rust, carpeting the forest floor in a mulch that squelches underfoot with the rot of fallen mast. Thrace, in the waning days of the Persian satrapies, around 480 BCE, when Xerxes' host had trampled southward but left the northern marches to their brooding isolation, was no realm of golden torques and bardic halls, though the later Alexandrian tales would gloss it so. It was a land of hardy exiles and herders, where Thracian tribes like the Odrysians scratched livelihoods from the thin soils with ards of fire-hardened wood, their furrows shallow to avoid the bedrock that lurked just inches below. Villages clung to the river valleys of the Hebrus, clusters of round huts thatched with reed bundles weighted by stones against the gales, their interiors dim with the smoke of hearths fueled by dried dung patties slapped from the flanks of half-wild ponies. You navigate these woods now, your cloak heavy with damp from the morning mist that rises off the streams, the air thick with the fungal earthiness of mushrooms pushing through the leaf litter, and the faint, musky undernote of wolf sign, scat studded with hair bones, left at trail forks as territorial missives. The pulse of this tale centers in the glade of the wolf mothers, a clearing encircled by ancient yews whose trunks twist like the torsos of dancers frozen mid-reel, a site revered by the local Getae clans as a nexus of Artemis's untamed favor. Life here orbited the pack's necessities, the guardians not mythical shades, but flesh and blood sentinels, orphaned wolf cubs raised by the tribe's women, their dens dug into the hillside burrows lined with bracken and sheep wool carded loose to mimic the dam's lining. These were no pets of the hearth, but partners in vigilance, taught to shadow the herds through the passes, their howls a night alarm against raiders from the Scythian steppes, who swept down with curved bows of horn and lances tipped in flint. The women of the clan, broad-hipped figures in skirts of plaid wool woven on ground looms, their patterns checked in the dyes of woad and madder foraged from the riverbanks, managed the dual weave of domesticity and defense. Mornings saw them milking the ewes in low folds of wattle hurdles, the milk strained through cheesecloth into turned wooden pails, curdled with rennet from a suckling lamb's stomach, to yield the soft cheese that sustained the long watches. Artemis materializes in this weave not as a spectral huntress, but as a wanderer from the southern myths, her form cloaked in the skins of deer flayed with obsidian blades, drawn northward by the land's feral cadence that echoes her Delian cradle. The Homeric hymns allude to her Thracian sojourns, her arrows felling the bear of Erymanthus. But the grit lies in the incremental, the way she pauses at a stream to quench her thirst, cupping the peaty water in hands calloused from unstrung bows, or how she notes the spiral of a snail's track across a mossy stone, a pattern akin to the moon's phases etched in her mind. Thrace summons her for its margins, the vast woods where Roman legions would later hack roads, but now harbor the untrammeled, where pines drop cones like forgotten offerings, their seeds harvested by the women who roast them in clay ovens sunk into the earth, the nuts ground into a meal that thickens the winter's pottage. The clan's women first glimpse her at the glade's edge, during the autumn cull when the herds are driven to the higher pastures to graze the last tender shoots before the snows bind the heights. You are with them, basket slung from your shoulder, woven from split osiers, stripped green and dried slow to prevent cracking, filled with the wool tufts gathered from the brambles where the sheep have brushed. They are a resilient cadre. Lissa, named for the foam at a wolf's jowl, her arms corded from years of twisting sinew into bowstrings. Or Meta, with eyes sharp as the thorns she pricks her fingers on while carding fleeces over combs of bone, her tales laced with the dialect of the Odressian lowlands. Artemis emerges from the mist-shrouded tree line, her hair matted with burrs and leaves like a crown of the wild's indifference. Tunic girded with a belt of rawhide from which dangles a quiver of reed shafts fletched with eagle-tail feathers plucked from the cliffs. She kneels by the U-circle, tracing the carved runes, simple incisions of wolf heads and crescent moons, renewed yearly with chisels of antler, without reverence or haste, as if renewing an old acquaintance. What follows is a slow interlacing of her sojourn into the clan's fabric, akin to the gradual felting of wool under repeated fulling with the feet in urine-soaked tons. A process the women demonstrate in the village's central pit, their skirts kilted high as they tread the cloth to mat the fibers, the acrid steam rising like a ward against the chill. Artemis lingers, drawn to their guardianship of the pack. For in Thrace, the wolves were more than scourge. They were the land's own militia. Cubs whelped in spring from dams snared gently with padded loops of nettle cord. Nursed on goat's milk drawn warm from the udder and supplemented with minced hare softened in broth. She watches as Lysa feeds the yearlings, her hand steady in the den's mouth, offering chunks of venison toughened by the hunt's chase. The meat jerked over slow fires of alder smoke to preserve against the lean moons. They learned the voice first, Lyssa explains, her tone matter-of-fact as the winds sough, demonstrating a low whistle pitched to the ear's edge, a call that summons the juveniles from their burrow with tails low but alert, their coats shedding the first underfur in puffs that the women collect for spindle stuffing. Under Artemis's gaze, the women's routines acquire new inflections, the guardianship evolving like a river carving its bed deeper with each flood. Afternoons bring the tracking drills in the wood's labyrinth, where the pack is loosed to shadow phantom foes. Bundles of rags stuffed with straw dragged on lines of twisted bark to mimic raiders' retreat. The women follow, staffs of hazel shod with iron nails traded from the coastal emporia, their steps measured to read the understory. The snapped twigs fresh break, sap beating like blood, the faint scrape of paw on loam, direction gleaned from the drag of dew on needles. Artemis joins without invitation, her strides silent as the mists creep, pointing out the overlooked. A vole's burrow tunneled anew, its mound a sign of softening frost that might draw the herds too early to the lowlands. The pack responds to her instinctively, the alpha bitch, a gray-mantled female with a scar across her muzzle from a boar's tusk, circling her flanks not in challenge but affiliation. nose to wrist in a sniff that seals an unspoken pact. Evenings gather them at the glade's hearth, a ring of boulders enclosing a fire pit, where flames are coaxed from flint and tinder fungus, pried from birch trunks. The blaze fed with cones that pop their seeds into the embers like tiny libations. Suppers are frugal symposia, stews of lentils simmered with wild garlic bulbs foraged from the oak roots. The pot of unglazed clay stirred with wooden spoons, carved from the same hazel as the staffs. Portions ladled into horn bowls hollowed from aurochs killed in the spring drive. Here, amid the smoke's curl that stings the eyes like unshed tears, stories unspool. Meta recounts a winter when Scythian horsemen torched the upper folds, the wolves' howls rallying the clan to hidden caves stocked with silos of acorn meal leached in running streams to draw the bitterness. The group surviving on flatbreads baked on hot stones, their crusts imprinted with paw prints for Artemis's mark. Artemis listens, her contributions sparse but weighted, fragments of Arcadian hunts where snares were woven from spider silk, or Brauron's dances that taught the body's yield to the pack's flow, infusing the tales with a southern cadence that tempers the Thracian grit. The clan's resilience shines in these shared vigils, the women adapting the goddess's whispers into their arsenal. New whistle cadences pitched to Artemis's hummed tones, calling the wolves from afar without startling the ewes, or pelts treated with a rub of pine resin and urine from the alpha, masking human scent on the scouts' cloaks for night patrols. The men, returning from the river fisheries with creels of carp, scaled with knives of bronze, note the shift. The packs bolder in their circuits, scattering foxes that prey on the lambs without drawing blood from the flocks. Personal threads bind it. Lysa, widowed by a border skirmish, finds in Artemis a mirror for her solitary watches, the goddess's bow a counter to her own sling of weighted thong. Meta, her fingers scarred from a whelping gone awry, learns from her the binding of wounds with cobwebs stretched thin over yarrow leaves. The poultice's draw pulling poison like a loom's tension evens the weft. Yet as the leaves thicken the forest floor, muffling the steps like a conspirator's hush, a subtle discord threads the glade's peace. The wolves grow restless, their howls threading the nights with an urgency that scatters the ponies into nervous herds, and sightings multiply of shadows on the eastern ridges. Perhaps stragglers from the Persian retreat, or wilder kin drawn by the pack's swelled ranks. The women sharpen their awareness, stakes driven deeper into the den walls with mallets of elk antler, but the air hums with the threshold's edge, Artemis's presence both anchor and accelerant. And so, as you crouch by the hearth's glow, the flames flicker, etching wolf profiles on the yew trunks, you muse. In the whispered guardianship of Thrace's woods, what pack does Artemis summon from the margins? A bulwark woven tight against the encroaching dark, or a chorus that howls the wild's unraveling call? You press deeper into the Thracian autumn as the leaves accumulate like unanswered summons, their decay releasing a ferment that clings to your cloak's hem and seeps into the boots of cured leather stuffed with dry moss for insulation against the night's encroaching bite. The Hemus winds carve through the beeches with a low moan, stripping branches bare and funneling the chill down the glade's throat, where the yews stand sentinel, their needles a dark gloss that sheds rain in precise droplets. The clan's routines in the Wolf Mother's precinct harden against this seasonal siege. The women's guardianship of the pack evolving under Artemis's steadying influence, much like the gradual tempering of a blade in the slow cool of a dung-heap forge. Unseen shifts that bind edge to core, without brittle fracture. The river Hebrus runs fuller now, its banks muddied by the first spates, where the women wade ankle-deep to harvest watercress, its peppery stems bundled in rush sheaves and carried back in baskets balanced on hips scarred from prior loads. Artemis's integration deepens the clan's weave, her southern cadence threading into the Thracian warp with the subtlety of a single strand of finer wool amid the course. Mornings summon the women to the den's vicinity, where the yearlings, now lanky adolescents with coats roughed by the season's scruff, test their bounds, nipping at the tethers of braided nettle that the women renew daily, splicing in fresh lengths twisted wet to set the fibers grip. Lysa, her arms veined like the roots that anchor the ewes, demonstrates the whistle's nuances under Artemis's watchful eye. A rising glissando for recall, pitched to mimic the vixen's yip that summons the young from cover, followed by a staccato trill to halt, sharp as the snap of a snare's release. Artemis refines it, her lips pursing to a lower register drawn from Arcadian glades, the tone carrying farther through the understory without alerting the distant herds. A modulation tested on the alpha bitch, who wheels mid-prowl, ears pricked like yew-bows drawn taut. The women practice in relays, their breaths fogging the air as they pair off, one whistling while the other shadows on all fours, mimicking the pack's flank. The exercise ending in shared corrections over handfuls of dried bilberries foraged from the low shrubs, their tart burst a reward that stains tongues purple as the evening's dusk. The broader context of Thrace's fractious marches infuses these drills with urgency. The land's history, a palimpsest of migrations etched in the cairns that dot the ridges. Piles of river stones topped with skulls of aurochs, bleached white by sun and set as wards against the Odrysians' rivals, the Tribali who raid from the Danube's forks. The women share this lore around the midday halt, seated on logs felled by adzes of iron hafted in oak, their cloaks spread as ground cloths to keep the damp at bay. Meals are portable affairs, flatbreads of barley meal mixed with the ground acorns leached in the Hebrus's shallows, tannins drawn out by overnight soaks in burlap sacks weighted with pebbles, the dough kneaded with ewe's cheese rendered soft in the morning's milk. As they tear the loaves, dipping into communal bowls of yogurt soured in skin bags slung from saddles, Meta recounts the clan's endurance through the Persian passage, how the satrap's foragers had fired the beachmast, starving the pigs that fattened the larders, forcing the women to trek to the coastal salt pans for fish dried on racks of split pine, the fillets pounded with pestles of granite to flake into pottages stretched with nettle seeds gathered in autumn's hush. Artemis listens, her contributions measured, tales of Delos's cisterns rationed drop by drop, or Brauron's mud that taught the foot's yield, binding the narratives into a shared resilience, where the pack's loyalty mirrors the clan's unyielding knot. Survival strategies unfold in the guardianship's daily grind, the woods yielding their curriculum under Artemis's subtle hand. Afternoons turn to snare setting along the game trails, where the women instruct the goddess in the Thracian craft, pits camouflaged with lattice of birch twigs interwoven like a loom's shed, baited with offal from the ewes culled lean, the traps lined with stakes whittled sharp to impale without waste. Artemis adapts swiftly, her fingers deft at the lattice's weave, incorporating a southern twist, a loop of sinew that tightens on contact, drawn from Arcadian hairlines, ensuring the quarry's quick dispatch to spare prolonged thrashing that alerts the herd. You join a setting party, your hands chafed from the birch's sap that blisters like a poorly tilled hide, as the pack is loosed to quarter the underbrush, noses low to the loam where the scent cones narrow to a deer's slot. The wolves' pads leaving prints that the women read like tallies on a counting stick. 4 toes splayed for the hind, the dewclaw's ghost mark indicating fresh passage. A young buck falls to the pit, its antlers velvet-sheathed and tangled in the lattice. The dispatch merciful with a spear thrust through the throat. The blood caught in a bowl of turned wood to mix with the evening's stew, its iron tang a fortifier against the winter's pallor. The clan's women incorporate these yields into their evening rites at the glade. The hearth's flames banked low to conserve the cone's embers through the night. The fire fed incrementally with armfuls of deadfall gathered in slings of plaid wool. Suppers simmer in cauldrons of bronze traded from the emporia at Byzantium, hung on tripods of forged iron whose legs sink into the earth for stability against the wind's shove. Venison haunches seared first to seal the juices, then braised with roots of wild carrot foraged from the river's bends, the tubers scrubbed clean with brushes of heather to remove the grit that grinds teeth like unwinnowed chaff. As the steam rises, veiling faces in its warmth, personal stories surface like bubbles in the boil. Lissa speaks of her daughter's first whelp, a cub taken too soon by distemper, its body wrapped in a pelt of her own weaving and laid in a cairn atop the ridge, the loss teaching her the whistle's softer tones for soothing the fevered. Meta shares the mending of a torn den lining after a vixen's raid, stuffing it anew with underfur combed from the alpha during her seasonal shed, the fibers curl-trapping air against the frost's creep. Artemis, seated cross-legged on a pelt stretched taut, offers a counterpoint from the Thracian echoes in her myths, the Niobids' slaughter that swelled her arrows with sorrow, a grief channeled into the pack's vigilant chorus, her voice trailing into a hum that stills the yearlings at the glade's rim. Tensions knot as the encroaching shadows sharpen, the wolves' restlessness manifesting in wider circuits that bring them to the village's outskirts, their eyes reflecting the hearth's glow like twin moons in the pony's flanks. The men, returning from the Hebris with creels slung low and dripping, report tracks interleaving with human prints, stragglers, perhaps, from the Persian remnants, their fires glimpsed on the eastern scarps, or wilder kin pushed southward by the steppes' hardening frosts. The women reinforce the glade's wards, runes recarved deeper with antler chisels, anointed with blood from the cull mixed with pine pitch to set the scent. Dens shored with buttresses of stacked stone mortared with clay from the riverbed, dug fresh each dawn to check for undermining paws. Artemis advises on diversions, scattering the alpha's urine along the borders, diluted in bowls of stream water to extend its reach, or burning bundles of artemisia whose acrid smoke veils the trails like a weft drawn across the warp. Yet incidents accrue. A pony hobbled by fangs in the night, its tendon severed clean as a loom's cut thread, forcing the herders to splint it with hazel rods lashed in place. The beast's limp a drag on the morning drives. Through these fraying days, the narrative coils toward its crux. The pack's guardianship pulling taut against the wood's inexorable press. The women sense it in the whistle's echo lingering longer, in Artemis's gaze turning eastward where the ridges bruise purple at dawn. As the first flakes dust the beaches like ash from a distant pyre, heralding the snows that will blanket the trails in white oblivion, a larger silhouette stirs, howls from the heights, not the pack's familiar timbre, but a rogue chorus swelling with the wind's promise of convergence or clash. The clan braces, bows strung with fresh sinew twisted damp and dried slow to hold the curve, wondering if this is the weaving of alliance or the snarl that unravels. But as you hunker by the cauldron's steam, the stew's bubble sinking with the Hebrus's distant rush. A murmur rises like unloosed fur. Will Artemis harness these whispers into a pack unified, a guardian weave that turns the wild's howl to the clan's steadfast shield? Or will the shadow's chorus fracture the bond, scattering the wolves into the winter's unforgiving maw? Winter's vice clamps down on the Thracian glade as the first true snows mantle the Haemus slopes in a seamless white shroud, muffling the Hebrus's voice to a subdued gurgle beneath ice floes that fringe its banks like frayed hems. You huddle in the U-circle, the women's cloaks drawn tight against the wind's probing fingers, their plaid wool crusted with rime that flakes off in the hearth's meager warmth. The rogue chorus swells through the nights, a dissonant overlay to the clan's familiar howls, deeper timbres rolling from the eastern ridges, laced with the urgency of displaced alphas driven by the steppes' iron frosts or the lingering scent of Persian stragglers' cookfires. The glade's hearth burns low, embers husbanded under a dome of ash to stretch the cone's yield. The flames flicker, etching elongated shadows on the rune-carved trunks that seem to lean inward, as if the woods themselves conspire in the vigil. This is the forge's quench, where Artemis's guardianship tempers the pack's bond against the wild's severing blade, not in a clash of fangs and steel, but in the deliberate convergence of whistle and shadow, the incremental hold that turns peril's snarl to sustenance. The climax unfurls on a dawn when the sky hangs leaden, the snow falling in fat, reluctant flakes that cling to the beach's branches like unshed burdens. The women rouse before the false light, their breaths pluming in the hut's confines, where the air hangs heavy with the sour tang of unwashed wool and the faint, ferrous note of blood from a ew's hasty cull. Lysa, her face gaunt in the lamplight of horn lanterns fueled by rendered fat, distributes the signals. Bone whistles carved from deer femurs, hollowed with awls of iron and strung on thongs of twisted sinew, each tuned to a pitch that layers the clan's call with Artemis's modulated trill. The party assembles, 10 strong, cloaks reversed to their dun linings for camouflage against the snow's glare, staffs shod with nails hammered flush to avoid the glint that betrays. Artemis stands at the fore, her quiver slung low and bow of yew unstrung to spare the string's twist in the damp. her presence a quiet axis that aligns the women's steps without command, their boots crunching a path, trampled firm from prior watches. The trek to the ridges consumes the morning. Pauses marked by sips from skin flasks of mead thinned with stream water, honey from wild hives raided in summer, fermented in oak barrels charred inside to seal the staves, its faint buzz a bulwark against the numb that creeps into fingertips. The pack shadows them, leashes slipped at the tree line, the alpha bitch's gray form merging with the trunks as she quarters ahead, nose low to the crust where the rogue's prints interlace like a poorly heddled cloth, splayed pads deeper than the clan's, laced with the drag of a limp from some border wound. Signs accumulate. A pony's frozen ear tuft, gnawed clean and discarded like a shuttle's broken end. Scat steaming faintly in a hollow, studded with the wool of Thracian plaid, its placement at a cairn's base a deliberate taunt. The women read it in silence, Mida's fingers tracing the print's splay to gauge the intruder's count. 7, perhaps 8, their circuit tightening like a noose drawn on the village's flanks. As the ridge crests under a sky that spits sleet like accusations, the confrontation materializes not in open charge, but in the wood's veiled arithmetic. The rogue pack emerges from a thicket of firs, their coats matted and eyes hollowed by the lean migration, led by a scarred male whose muzzle twists in a ruff of frost-rimed fur. A low growl ripples through them, answered by the clan's wolves fanning wide, the alpha's hackles rising like a warp stretched taut. Panic flickers. A young scout's staff slips on glare ice, clattering against a stone that echoes like a dropped spindle. But Artemis's whistle cuts it, a layered cascade that starts low and rises to the glissando's peak. The alpha responding with a yip that cascades through her kin, drawing the rogues into a hesitant circle rather than lunge. The women hold the flanks, slings whirring with stones wrapped in cloth to muffle the thud, projectiles of river pebbles selected for their even weight, slung in arcs that glance off shoulders without maim, herding the intruders toward the prepared snare line. A web of nettle cord stretched low between hazel stakes, camouflaged with snow-dusted branches, its nooses padded with wool tufts to blunt the bite. The fray resolves in a gritty equilibrium, the snow churned to slush under the press of paws and boots, the air acrid with musk and the metallic tang of a shallow graze where a rogue's fang nicks Lissa's calf. Blood welling hot through her legging of oiled leather. The women deploy the nets with the precision of loom workers advancing the cloth. Meda looping a foreleg while Artemis looses a warning arrow, its shaft thudding into a birch trunk inches from the leader's ear. The fletchings whisper a stay rather than strike. The pack's chorus fractures, the rogue's growls tapering to whines as the alpha circles, nipping flanks to corral without cull, her kin falling in behind like threads drawn through the shed. One intruder, a yearling with ribs like ladder rungs, collapses into the snare, its thrash muffled by the wool. The women dispatch it swiftly with a staff's butt to the temple, the body dragged aside for the evening's yield, its pelt destined for den linings to warm the whelps come spring. The scarred male holds longest, eyes locked on Artemis in a standoff that spans heartbeats, until her steady gaze, gray as the mist off the Hebrus, prompts a dip of head, the rogue wheeling his pack eastward in retreat, their forms dissolving into the firs like smoke from a quenched forge. The aftermath is the true labor, a meticulous unraveling of tension into provision, the party lingering on the ridge as the sleet eases to a hesitant flake. The wounded are tended on the spot, Lissa's gash cleaned with snow packed into the wound to numb and staunch, then bound with cobwebs stretched thin over yarrow leaves, gathered fresh from the understory. The poultices draw, pulling the edges together like a seamstress's gather. The snare's yield is field-dressed with flint knives flaked keen on antler backs, entrails buried shallow to return to the loam without drawing crows that might alert stragglers. The meat portioned into haunches, wrapped in birch bark, stripped in one continuous sheet to preserve the warmth. The return bears the weight of quiet triumph, the pack flanking loose but vigilant, their tongues lolling in clouds of vapor as the women haul the litter on poles lashed with spare cord. Pauses to shift the load marked by shared sips from the flasks. The mead's residue licked from lips to waste nothing. Back at the glade, the integration seals in the hearth's glow. The cauldron filled anew with the rogue's haunch, braised slow over embers raked fine. Its broth thickened with the clan's lentils simmered from the silos. Grains winnowed clean of chaff with sieves of horsehair, stored in pits lined with clay to fend the damp. The women portion it into horn bowls, the steam-veiling faces etched with the night's residue. Stories threading the meal like veins in the yews wood. Lissa toasts the alpha with a raised bowl, crediting Artemis's whistle for the circle's hold. Meta recounts the pelt's future, its cure in a ton of oak bark decoction drawn from the river's bends, the tannins setting the hide supple for cloaks that will mask the scouts come the thaws. Personal closures bind it. The young scout, chastened by her slip, apprentices to the whistle's craft, practicing tones until they echo the goddess's hum. Artemis herself, seated by the flames, traces a rune on the snow-damp earth with a stick of hazel, its curve evoking the pack's unified arc, a mark that the women etch permanent with chisel and pitch. This denouement fortifies the clan's sinews against winter's deeper gales, the rogue retreat scattering the shadows that gnawed the borders. The pack's ranks swelled subtly by a lone female who lingers at the den's mouth, her integration marked by the alpha's tolerant sniff. The men incorporate the yield into the drives, the extra meat jerked thin on racks of split pine over slow smokes of Artemisia, strips pounded flat with mallets of elk bone to pack light for the high pastures. Wards renew at the yews, blood from the cull smeared on the runes, mixed with the alpha's underfur combed free in the morning's light. The scent a lingering claim that deters the steppes' wanderers. Artemis's sojourn fades into the wood's weave as spring's murmur stirs the Hebrus's ice, her form slipping southward like a shadow at solstice, leaving the women with whistles tuned finer, packs that quarter wider without fray. As the snow melts to rivulets tracing the glade's contours like veins replenished, the Thracian woods exhale into continuity, the herds ascending the passes with bells muffled in wool, the Hebrus swelling to carry the clan's woven plaids to coastal trade. You trace the rune's faint scar on the yew bark, its line enduring like the pack's low chorus at dawn. In this whispered vigil, Artemis embodies the margin's quiet pact, the wolf's flank against the raid, the whistle's thread binding wild to hearth, resilience forged in the snow's unyielding press. Ponder, then, as the wind carries the first green scent from the valleys, in our fractured frontiers, where borders blur and shadows lengthen unchecked, does Artemis's Thracian legacy endure? That guardianship thrives not in isolation's howl, but in the pack's patient weave, turning the encroaching wild into the enduring shelter of the shared watch. As the Thracian snows begin their gentle thaw, melting into quiet rivulets that trace the yew's roots like forgotten lullabies, you find yourself easing back from the glade's edge, the wood's vast embrace softening around you. The pack's distant chorus fades now, not into silence, but into a harmonious murmur, the wolves' breaths mingling with the wind's sigh as they settle into their dens, pelts warmed by the earth's slow awakening. Artemis, that elusive guardian of margins, lingers just a moment longer in the half-light, her form dissolving like mist over the Hebrus, leaving behind not echoes of strife, but the steady rhythm of resilience, the way a single whistle can call kin from the shadows, weaving wild hearts into the hearth's quiet glow. Breathe with me now, as the silver moon dips toward the horizon, her light pooling softly in the hollows where beech leaves unfurl their tender greens, promising the spring's unhurried return. In these ancient tales of Artemis's wanderings, from Delos's rocky cradle to Arcadia's woven hunts, Brauron's moonlit dances, and Thrace's whispered pacts, you have journeyed through the ordinary miracles that shaped the divine. The midwife's steady hand, the snare's patient knot, the paw's imprint on muddied paths. These are not storms to fear, but gentle tides that carry us, reminding you of your own quiet strengths, the threads of endurance that bind the frayed edges of days. Rest easy, dear listener, as the imagery drifts away like pollen on a warming breeze. The wolves curling close, the river's song lulling the night. Let the moon's whisper cradle you safe in the wild's tender fold, until dawn's first blush stirs you anew. Sleep now under her watchful gaze, and dream of silver paths yet untrod.